The 1st of August 1942. On the steppe, 6th Army's units spent the day securing their positions, with only minor local actions being recorded by the troops. These actions were the dregs of the fighting that had gone on in the previous days, which had just drawn to a close. With a new lull in the fighting, Paulus's 6th Army was sat in place. Its objective, reaching Kalach and encircling the enemy and destroying it in a Kesselschlacht cauldron battle, remained unfulfilled. In fact, to some of the units on the ground, it wasn't certain who had encircled who, and losses for some of the Axis units, such as 100th Jaeger Division, have been especially high. Weitersheim's and Langermann's Panzer Corps were now immobilized due to a lack of fuel, and all of Paulus's men were exhausted after days of hard defensive fighting brought on by the previous Soviet counterattacks. The lull did provide an opportunity for both sides to rest though, and they could use this opportunity to gather their strength and prepare for their next move. So Paulus decided to do just that and began to reorganize his forces. Given the lack of fuel and ammunition, which would take time to restock, it was decided to launch the next attack on the 6th of August in 5 days' time. Heitz's 8th Army Corps, with the 305th, 113th and 384th Infantry Divisions, were given the task of containing Kryochenkin's 4th Tank Army in its bridgehead south of Sirotinskaya. 14th and 24th Panzer Corps were ordered to advance on Kalach again, and began preparations to do so. And in addition, the OKH had released Strecker's 11th Army Corps and its 76th and 295th Infantry Divisions from the OKH Reserve. They arrived in 6th Army's rear areas on the 1st of August. A veteran from the First World War, a policeman during the violent political, social and economic crises of the Weimar Republic era, and a divisional commander during the Battle of France, Karl Strecker would be an important character in the dying days of the Stalingrad pocket. For now though, the reinforcement of the 6th Army with Strecker's corps would allow Paulus to continue his offensive once preparations had been made. What would also help Paulus was Richthofen's Luftflotte 4. Believing that the main reason that the 6th Army had stalled was because of the lack of fuel and supplies, Richthofen requested additional Ju-52s from the OKL and created a special Stalingrad transport region to shuffle supplies to Paulus's army. Due to this, and efforts on the ground to improve the logistical situation, supplies of fuel and ammunition began to arrive in larger quantities over the next few days. On the Soviet side, defensive preparations were being made in the Stalingrad area. Over the past few days, the 62nd, 64th and 1st and 4th Tank Armies had all been bloodied in battle, and many of the Soviet rifle divisions were under 50% strength. In fact, 6 badly depleted Soviet divisions were withdrawn into the Stavka Reserve to be replenished and reinforced for later operations. Tank losses had also been severe, with tank formations now at less than half strength. The Red Army would no longer enjoy the 5-to-1 superiority in tanks that they had had in the previous few weeks. They would now face panzer forces of roughly equal strength in numbers, which is clearly not good, especially when we consider that many of the remaining tanks were light tanks. As an example, 22nd Tank Corps' 3 brigades mustered 37 light tanks on the 1st of August, compared to 19 T-34s. Its 176th Brigade was down to just 5 tanks in total, so clearly, if they couldn't take on the Germans with a 5-to-1 superiority in numbers, how could they face them with equal numbers and with light tanks? These factors contributed to the opinion held by both Gordov and the Stavka that it would be difficult for Kopachi and Churikov's armies to hold their forward defences, which is why they decided to continue to launch more weak attacks over the next few days. We are getting an influx of reinforcements simultaneously with the enemy. I can't sit and wait until forces are concentrated because the enemy may become stronger and roll up the 62nd Army's right flank. This is why active operations are not ceasing here, although I know that this is resulting in mutual pulverizing. It appears that Gordov and Vasilevsky, who was demanding active operations during this period, were eager to remain on the western bank of the Don. Stalin also refused to allow a retreat to better defensive positions behind the Don. He had heard about the 192nd and 184th Divisions, who had retreated without orders in the previous days, and wanted to prevent such a thing from happening again. So Stalin now ordered 62nd and 64th Armies to create blocking detachments as directed by Order No. 227. There would be no unauthorised troop withdrawals. So yes, the weakened 62nd and 64th Armies would be forced to fight on the western bank of the Don, even though they were severely weakened by their previous fighting and the fact that they were in a precarious position on the map, a position which could result in their encirclement if the Germans took Kalach. Why Stalin and his generals didn't permit the 62nd Army to withdraw across the Don at this point is not clear, but they all seemed eager to keep fighting. They seemed to have convinced themselves that if they could bring up more reinforcements, the balance of forces would shift in their favour, allowing them to drive the Axis back and resolve the situation. Either way, the idea of conducting a tactical withdrawal into better positions, which was probably the best thing to do in this situation, did not enter their minds. But Soviet attention was about to be drawn to the south, as the situation there changed dramatically. Up until this moment, 4th Panzer Army had been busy advancing south towards the Caucasus. However, with Paulus's 6th Army now sat motionless at the Don Bend, directions trickled down from Hitler and Halder, ordering Hoth's forces to turn east and head towards Kotelnikovo, and eventually Stalingrad. At the Situation Conference, Jodl is given the word. He announces pompously that the fate of the Caucasus will be decided at Stalingrad, and that, in view of the importance of the battle, it would be necessary to divert forces from Army Group A to Army Group B, if possible, south of the Don. This is a dressed-up version of my own proposal, which I submitted to the Führer 6 days ago, when 4th Panzer Army struck across the Don. At that time, though, no one in the illustrious company of the OKW seemed to be able to grasp its significance. For the men of the 29th Motorised Falcon Division, these orders were completely unexpected. They thought they were going into the Caucasus, but that was not to be. Kemp's 48th Panzer Corps now wheeled eastwards across the open steppe. Heim's 14th Panzer Division led the way, with Fremery's 29th Motorised Division close behind. These moves caught the 51st Army completely off guard, as German forces cut between the 91st and 157th Rifle Divisions and split the Soviet Army in two. The 157th and 138th Rifle Divisions fled towards Kotelnikovo, followed by the 29th Motorised Division, which reached the outskirts of Dubovskoye by nightfall. The southern portion of the 51st Army was also driven south by 1st Panzer Army. As a result of this fresh disaster, the Stavka decided to reinforce Kotelnikovo with the Siberian 208th Rifle Division, a tank destroyer regiment, an artillery regiment, an engineer battalion, and the 6th Guards Tank Brigade with 44 T-34s, all of which were currently riding into the area by rail. With reports filtering down through the chain of command, Gordov scrambled to create some sort of defence in the rear areas of the Soviet lines, ordering Tolbukin's 57th Army out of reserve at Stalingrad to form a line running from the area south of Stalingrad to the Don. Tolbukin only had 2 divisions, the 15th Guards and 38th Rifle Divisions. However, as Falk points out, he did have an additional 6 engineering and sapper battalions, 2 Guards artillery regiments, and a tank destroyer brigade. So, Tolbukin was probably sent forwards to upgrade the defensive positions in that region whilst waiting for more units to arrive. So he probably wasn't expected to defend this 100 miles of front indefinitely. And Shumilov also reacted. He sent Colonel Alexander Smirnov's 154th Naval Rifle Brigade south along the Don to the far left flank of the 64th Army. He was hoping that Smirnov's Marines could block an Axis advance over the Askay River, where that met the Don. Clearly the Soviets were desperately trying to hold on, but time was simply not on their side, as Kempth's 48th Panzer Corps raced northeast. 2nd of August 1942. For the first time since the fighting had begun, 22nd Tank Corps actually received infantry support for its next attack. Unfortunately, the infantry it received were actually elements of Group Zaravlev that had broken out of the pocket in the previous fighting, so these weren't fresh forces and were probably half-starved. 22nd Tank Corps was also weak and equipped with mostly T-60s and T-70s. Nevertheless, it was supplemented by 40 KVs from the 133rd Heavy Tank Brigade, and so Shamshin started another attack. The rifle units, which were operating in conjunction with the Corps, were poorly organised and did not demonstrate tenacity in the attack. Upon the first fire encounter with the enemy's fire resistance, they halted their attack, and part of them fell back into the Balki. Shamshin's force barely went 3 kilometers before stubborn resistance and heavy artillery fire brought them to a halt. Meanwhile, the 23rd Tank Corps, a slightly better off formation with 45 T-34s and 33 light tanks, also attacked at 0300 hours. First, Soviet artillery strikes battered 3rd Motorized Division. Then Soviet infantry and tanks charged. In the confused combat that followed, one of 23rd Tank Corps' battalions actually managed to penetrate the enemy's lines, but seemingly disappeared and was never seen again. The Germans called in fighter support at 0800 hours, and 88mm guns were used to keep the rest of the Soviet tanks at bay. 29th Infantry Regiment's line was therefore able to hold against the pressure, allowing 103rd Panzer Battalion to counterattack and stabilise the situation. Reinhard only lost 1 man wounded during this engagement, and when the attack was called off, the 23rd Tank Corps had lost 51 tanks in total. It's worth noting that some of these were only damaged and were brought back into action, but even still, this was a significant loss of material for practically no gain. 60th Motorized Division was also under attack, and the 160th Panzer Battalion engaged the enemy in the hills. They managed to inflict heavy casualties on the incessant Soviet tank attacks, although they did lose 10 panzers this day. Many of the tank losses that the battalion had suffered would be repaired in the coming days, but for now this battalion's tank strength was roughly 15 tanks less than it should have been. While these minor actions were occurring in the north, the main events were happening in the south. The spearhead of the 29th Motorized Division consisted of Gradel's 129th Panzer Battalion, 2 battalions of 71st Infantry Regiment, most of the 243rd Sturmgeschütz Battalion, and some Nebelwerfers. They moved off at 0930 hours, keeping to the right of the railway line, and reached Semichnaya railway station at 1100 hours. Fighting their way into the southwestern part of Kotelnikovo at 1330 hours, the advanced detachment of Fremery's 29th Motorized Division swooped down upon the town's railway station and managed to capture it. This was really bad news for the 208th Rifle Division. 2 of the Siberians' trains arrived at the station after the Germans had captured it. Shells and machine guns hit them as they climbed down from their carriages. It was an impossible situation, and they were wiped out or routed. A 3rd train was hit nearby by German Stukas and also blown to pieces. The 4th and 5th trains of the division successfully delivered their remaining cargo to nearby stations. The 6th train couldn't find a platform to unload at, so the commander decided it should wait. A fateful decision. Stukas found it and also wiped it and its cargo out of existence. By the end of the day, all that remained of the division was the division's headquarters, an engineering battalion, the signals battalion, 4 rifle battalions, 1 artillery battalion, another battery of artillery, and an anti-tank battalion. Basically, half of the division was wiped out at the very moment it had arrived on the battlefield. The ages of the men of the division were between 25 to 32, or should we say had been. Worse, 2 of their ammunition trains were also smashed by Stukas, leaving its colonel, a man with no combat experience and who had only previously commanded a regiment, with a weak and scattered formation, completely disorganised with no communication or command structure, and now seriously undersupplied. Yet, the remnants continued to resist on the northern outskirts throughout the night as the colonel drove around in his staff car, desperately trying to make contact with his formations. What a complete disaster. Meanwhile, Heim's 14th Panzer Division had actually bypassed Kotelnikovo and the bulk of the 51st Army. It reached the town of Darganov to the east, and it's safe to say that 51st Army was in complete disarray, and it also seems that Kolomiets didn't know exactly what was going on at the front. Chuikov, who had been busy compiling his report for Gordov for his actions in late July as commander of the 64th Army, was suddenly summoned to General Shumilov's headquarters. At the house where Shumilov was living and working, I found the whole Army Military Council discussing a report by the Chief of Staff on the position on the left flank. The information was disturbing. Having been updated on the depressing situation, Chuikov was appointed Shumilov's deputy and was ordered to form a new battle group from a special headquarters staff detached from 64th Army. This became known as Chuikov's Southern Operational Group. Effectively, Chuikov was made commander of a corps-level unit, something very rare at this time in the Red Army. He was assigned the 29th Rifle Division and Smirnov's 154th Naval Rifle Brigade from 64th Army. He took charge of the 138th and 157th Rifle Divisions from 51st Army, and was later reinforced by 6th Guards Tank Brigade from Stalingrad Front's reserves. In addition, the 229th, 204th and 112th Rifle Divisions from Shumilov's force were given to Kolpachi, in order to allow Shumilov and Chuikov to concentrate on defending the Askay River line. Chuikov was quite happy with this new arrangement because he no longer had to write his report for Gordov, which was a bit of a relief. He and his new HQ therefore set off south with 3 trucks, one of which had radio equipment. Chuikov first visited the 214th Rifle Division, which had performed well during the July battles and was now entrenched on the eastern bank of the Don. General Biryukov informed him that the situation was quiet and that the Germans weren't attempting to cross the Don in this area. Biryukov and I sat beside a haystack and drank Don water with ice. How he got the ice, I have no idea. But knowing that his western flank was secure, Chuikov then continued further south, finding the 29th Rifle Division's headquarters, where he stayed the night. Also that evening, 49-year-old Colonel General Andrei Yeremenko arrived in Moscow, having been summoned the day before. Yeremenko was an experienced general who joined the Tsar's army in 1913, had fought in several battles in 1941 and 42, and had been recovering from a leg wound sustained in the fighting. Now he was in a dimly lit room inside the Kremlin with the State Defense Committee, the GKO. Stalin informed Yeremenko and Vasilevsky that, because of the crisis to the south, he had decided to split the Stalingrad front into 2 parts. Yeremenko would command one of these parts, the new southeastern front, while Gordov would remain in command of the Stalingrad front. Yeremenko asked Stalin if he could make a suggestion. Stalin granted him this request, so Yeremenko said that the dividing line between the 2 new fronts should not run through Stalingrad itself, and that one front should have command over the city of Stalingrad. Stalin was not happy and snapped at Vasilevsky. Everything stays as we proposed. Stalingrad front is to split into 2 fronts. The boundary line between the fronts is to run along the line of the river Saryts and then on to Kalach. Stalin also ordered the redesignation of the elite Soviet airborne divisions. They now became known as Guards Rifle Divisions and began moving to the Stalingrad region. The ex-airborne 35th and 36th Guards Rifle Divisions were due to arrive on the 12th of August. And, although it would take time to be fully implemented, the Stavka also formed a new air army to support the changes on the ground. Kryukin's 8th Air Army would support the new southeastern front, but General Stepanov's new 16th Air Army would support the old Stalingrad front. Of course, this newly formed air army was vastly under strength, with poor logistics and inexperienced crews. Still, it was better than nothing. However, all these changes may have come a little too late to resolve the situation, which was, by now, developing rapidly to the south. Historian Jason D. Mark has released many Stalingrad unit histories of such excellence that other historians and publishing houses should, quite frankly, be ashamed. The physical versions of his books look like they were handed down by the gods themselves. The paper is high quality, the pictures are clear, the maps are stunning, and you're not going to find more about these units anywhere else. My biggest regret was buying his 24th Panzer Division history on Kindle and not getting the physical version of the book. I highly recommend you check out his website, theleapinghorseman.com, link in the description. And again, this is not a sponsored video. 3rd of August 1942. Fremery's 29th Motorised Division was now ordered to secure a bridgehead over the Yasilovsky-Askey River in order to prevent Soviet forces in the Don area from escaping to the south and the southeast. Heim's 14th Panzer Division, which had just seized the village of Zutovo, was ordered to advance on their right. Having captured some fuel in Kotonikovo, 29th Motorized Division formed another spearhead consisting of 29th Motorcycle Battalion, 129th Panzer Battalion, and 1 Artillery Battalion. They then moved to Karaichev, got caught in a traffic jam with 14th Panzer Division, before forging a crossing across the river. But they were stopped northeast of Nizhny Cherny by strong Soviet flanking fire on their left. As a result of this, they were 30 kilometers short of their day's objective by the end of the day. On their right, the 150 tanks of 14th Panzer Division sliced north of the river, captured Askey itself, and reached Peregruzhny. This was 40 kilometers further than the 29th Motorized Division had gone. The Romanian 1st and 2nd Infantry Divisions had also pushed the remaining Soviet forces back from the Kotonikovo area towards the north, with the remains of the Siberian 208th Rifle Division falling back to Chilikovo Station, having previously routed. These moves had put pressure on Churykov's flank, but even so, Kempf wasn't happy. 29th Motorized Division's performance had been poor, so Kempf called Fremery at 2100 hours, demanding to know what had happened. Fremery made his excuses, but the events of the day had been an embarrassment to him and his division. It soon became apparent that Red Army units would not be taking to their heels. A copy of Stalin's Order No. 227, better known as the Not One Step Back Order, had fallen into German hands. Hoth's HQ informed its subordinate units about this on the 3rd of August, noting one passage in particular. Red Army units must hold the line, severe punishment for retreating without orders. This directive soon added starch to the Soviet defences. Churikov was also driving around his front with 5 trucks now. He'd got 2 more from the 29th Rifle Division, and he was busy rallying his various units. The 138th and 157th Rifle Divisions had taken a beating in the previous days, having been in action under 51st Army. Colonel Loidnikov was down to 4,200 men, while Colonel Kuropatyenko had just 1,500. His division could barely even be called a division, since he had fewer men than a single regiment should have had. It's no wonder that Churikov had to steady both of their nerves before ordering them to withdraw behind the Askey. Once across, they could recover their cohesion whilst digging new defences. Smirnov's brigade, a unit Churikov described as a good, reliable force, was to move behind these divisions to form a second line of defence, and Churikov had 40 tanks at his disposal to shore up his lines. It was hoped that the Askey River, which wasn't so wide but had steep banks and was flanked by marshy ground, would offer enough protection to deter Axis attacks. Even so, Churikov's southern operational group was being pressed on all sides at this point, was almost out of ammunition, had lost communication with the 64th Army, and was currently being pounded mercilessly by the Luftwaffe. 4th of August 1942. In 100th Jaeger Division's area, the Soviet 186th Rifle Regiment sent 2 rifle battalions and 6 T-34s into a 2-kilometer wide gap between the Croatian Legion, now reduced to the size of 1 battalion, and the 536th Infantry Regiment on its right. T-34s rolled over the position of 2 Pak anti-tank guns, and the Croatian wing began to crumble. But by noon, they had managed to gather themselves, had counterattacked, and had restored the situation. They'd knocked out 4 or 5 of the T-34s and captured over 130 Soviet prisoners for the loss of 6 men and 23 wounded. But the main events continued to be in the 4th Panzer Army's area. 29th Motorised Division's Spearhead raced off at 04:45 hours through Samkin, aiming for the Askay River. They managed to clear Zutov railway station of Soviet troops and took a railway bridge intact slightly to the east as well. Unfortunately for the Axis, this bridge, and another that they had captured nearby, were not stable enough to cross, so engineers had to prop up the structures before the Panzers could use them. This meant that 29th Motorised Division was barely across the Askay by nightfall. Again, not great considering their performance the day before. As this was happening, Chuikov had visited the Siberian 208th Rifle Division, reaching a farm where some of the riflemen were. This was to the west of Chilikov Station, where other elements of the division were disembarking. Some villagers told Chuikov that Romanian troops were crossing the Don, which was a surprise because the Soviets didn't know that the Romanian 6th Army Corps was in the area until this moment. Chuikov was unable to find the 208th Rifle Division's headquarters or their commander, and continued to have difficulties getting in contact with the 64th Army over the radio. After a while, someone informed him that 64th Army was finally answering. Just then, Chuikov looked up and saw Red Army aircraft flying overhead. They flew to the Chilikov station area and released their bombs on their own men. I could see the carriages and the station buildings on fire, with raging flames rapidly leaping from one building to another. Chuikov quickly radioed 64th Army. "At Chilikov station, our aircraft are bombing our troop trains." Chuikov then came under air attack himself, with one plane swooping down upon his position and spraying him with machine gun fire. The planes had mistaken Soviet formations for Axis ones. It should be noted that General Chuikov wrote several different versions of this air attack over the years. The first, his beginning of the road, was censored. The attacking Soviet aircraft were changed into German aircraft. Another, Stalingrad Battle of the Century, corrected the story and firmly blamed the Soviet Air Force, VVS, for this mistaken attack upon the 208th Rifle Division. Typically, Chuikov's radio, having only just got in contact with the 64th Army's headquarters, was knocked out of action. He was left totally in the dark and unable to contact his own divisions, and still hadn't found the commander of the 208th Rifle Division. It was only that evening that he finally found the colonel. I remember his pale face and quivering voice. He was suffering from shock. The death of his men had had a terrible effect on him. The colonel explained that he couldn't go on in command of his division and couldn't reassemble his men, nor even face speaking to them after such terrible losses. Their morale, and his, were shattered. Chuikov realised that he had to stay with him and calm him down. Once he had brought him to his senses, he gathered the divisional command staff together, laid out tactical maps on a table, and formulated a plan of action. Chuikov ordered the Siberians to gather their remnants, retreat across the Askay overnight, and redeploy there. He then headed to Verkhny Kumskaya, where his newly improvised Southern Group headquarters had been busy setting up. Orders now came through to implement Stalin's decision made 2 nights previously to split Stalingrad front into 2 parts. Yeremenko's southeastern front was formed, and now took charge of Shumilov's 64th Army, Kolomiets' 51st Army, Tolbukin's 57th Army, and Colonel Tanashishin's 13th Tank Corps. It would also be supported by the now reduced 8th Air Army. Gordov's Stalingrad front now consisted of Kuznetsov's 63rd Army, Danilov's 21st Army, Kolpachi's 62nd Army, Kryuchenkin's 4th Tank Army, and Rodin's 28th Tank Corps. This will be supported by the newly formed 16th Air Army. Basically, 8th Air Army had been split in two. Having suffered heavy losses, Moskalenka's 1st Tank Army was disbanded. But to compensate, once it arrived in a few days' time, Gordov would receive Moskalenka's 1st Guards Army, which was made up of Guards divisions formed from the elite airborne divisions. In addition to these moves, Kolpachi was replaced as commander of 62nd Army with General Lopatin, a devout communist and ex-cavalryman who'd fought in the Civil War. And this allowed Kolpachi to become Moskalenka's deputy. A powerful figure, proud posture, large, excessive facial features, leisurely gestures, loud, clear, and also unhurried speech. Generally, Lopatin conveyed an impression of special calmness, which I remember even surprising me a little, in contrast to the usual tense and alarming atmosphere of those days. The question is, would these organisational changes and a new commander of 62nd Army be enough to stop the Axis onslaught? In preparation for his next move, and always eager to keep his armoured formations together in one giant fist, Kempf had ordered the 129th Panzer and 243rd Sturmgeschütz battalions to form a Schwerpunkt. It was hoped that this combined force would increase the chances of success for a deep thrust into the enemy's lines. Given the state of Soviet forces in the south, success was a likely outcome.